Shopping lists, in my experience, are about as threatening as grocery receipts and twice as boring. But when one appears uninvited in Fritz Brenner's kitchen, typed on my own Remington with its telltale crooked O and leaning O, and contains items that would make Fritz reach for his cleaver in righteous indignation, you can bet it's not about groceries, it's about war. It was 10:30 on a grey Tuesday morning in October when Fritz appeared in the office doorway, holding a sheet of paper like it might explode. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, communing with his orchids in that daily ritual that keeps him civilized and the rest of us safe from his temper. I was at my desk, wrestling with correspondence and wondering why people who can afford Wolfe's fees can't afford decent penmanship, when Fritz cleared his throat in a way that suggested imminent catastrophe. "Archie," he said, his Swiss accent thicker than usual, which meant he was either very pleased or very disturbed. The expression on his face ruled out pleasure. "I did not write this list. Fritz Brenner, for those who haven't had the privilege, is our chef, housekeeper, and guardian of all things edible. He treats the kitchen like a cathedral and margarine like blasphemy. If Fritz said he didn't write a list, then someone else had been playing games in his sacred domain." "What list?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was heading. He handed me the paper with the care one might use for a live grenade. It was torn from one of the memo pads that live on the kitchen wall, but the writing wasn't Fritz's careful script. It was typed, and I recognized the machine immediately. My own Remington with its distinctive quirks. The list read: saffron threads, 2 grams anchovies, oil-packed, 6 tins vanilla beans, Madagascar, 4 pods endive, Belgian, 3 heads duck fat rendered, 1 jar aged balsamic, 25-year, 1 bottle yeast, fresh cake, 2 blocks sea salt, fleur de sel, 500 grams, truffles, white, 50 grams eggs, quail, 2 dozen rosemary, fresh sprigs, at the bottom, in the same typed format. Deliver to rear service entrance, 3 p.m. sharp. Ring twice, wait 30 seconds. Ring once. I studied the list more carefully. These weren't just expensive ingredients. They were the kind of items that appeared in Wolfe's own recipes, the ones he discussed with Fritz in hushed, reverent tones. But there were subtle wrongnesses. Quail eggs instead of the duck eggs Wolfe preferred for certain dishes, Belgian endive when he always specified French, fresh yeast when he invariably used dry for particular preparations. "Fritz," I said, "when did you find this?" 20 minutes ago. I went to write the real list for today's marketing, and this was clipped to the board where mine should be." His face had the expression he usually reserved for people who suggested ketchup belonged on properly prepared beef. "Archie, someone has been in my kitchen." That got my attention in a hurry. The kitchen is Fritz's kingdom, and he guards it like a dragon guards gold. More importantly, it's connected to the rest of the brownstone by the back stairs, the route that Wolfe considers our most vulnerable point, and Fritz monitors with the vigilance of a Swiss guard. "The back door was locked?" I asked. Of course it was locked, but I was in the pantry for perhaps 10 minutes checking the wine inventory. Someone could have... He stopped, his face darkening. "Someone used your typewriter to mock my kitchen." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. In our business, timing like that usually means the plot is thickening right on schedule. The woman on our doorstep was built for business, not beauty, though she managed both without trying too hard. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical style, intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of composure that suggested she'd handled crises before. Her coat was good wool, her shoes were sensible, and her expression was that of someone who'd made a difficult decision and intended to see it through. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "I'm Dr. Margaret Kellner. I believe someone is trying to kill me, and they're using grocery lists to do it. I've heard stranger opening lines, but not many." "Come in," I said. "We specialize in unusual problems." In the office, I settled her in the red leather chair and took my time sizing her up while Fritz hovered nearby, still clutching his mysterious list. Dr. Kellner was probably in her early 40s, with the kind of calm competence that suggested either medical training or extensive experience with emergencies. She set a leather briefcase on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm a food chemist," she began, without preamble. "I work for Consolidated Foods, developing new preservation techniques and flavor enhancement processes. 3 weeks ago, I discovered something in our research files that shouldn't exist. Formulas for compounds that could be used to mask the taste and smell of certain unpleasant substances. Poisons, to be blunt." She paused, glancing at Fritz, who had gone very still. "I reported my findings to my supervisor, Dr. Harrison Webb. He assured me the formulas were theoretical, part of a discontinued project. But yesterday, I found this in my apartment mailbox." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a sheet of paper. It was another shopping list, typed on what looked like the same machine as the one Fritz had found. Almonds, bitter, raw, 1 pound apricot kernels dried, 8 ounces cherry pits, ground, 4 ounces cassava root, fresh, 2 pounds elderberries, fresh, 1 pint mushrooms, destroying angel, 6 caps oleander leaves, dried, 1 ounce rhubarb leaves, fresh, 8 ounces pokeweed berries, 4 ounces yew berries, 2 ounces. Even I knew enough about poisons to recognize what I was looking at. Every item on that list contained natural toxins, cyanide compounds, cardiac glycosides, and other substances that could kill in the right concentrations. The sound of the elevator descending from the plant rooms announced Wolfe's arrival. He entered the office with his usual measured pace, all 1/7 of a ton of him settling behind his desk like a mountain finding its proper place. His eyes took in the scene. Fritz with his list doctor, Kellner with hers, and me with what I hoped was an expression of professional alertness. "Good morning, Archie," he said, then turned his attention to our visitor. "Madame." "Doctor, Margaret Kellner," I said. "She has a problem involving grocery lists and poison." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Indeed, and Fritz appears to have a problem involving grocery lists and—" "What, Fritz?" "Insult," Fritz said simply. "Someone has violated my kitchen and mocked my provisions." I handed Wolfe both lists. He read them with the careful attention he usually reserved for rare book catalogues, his face revealing nothing. But I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant his interest was engaged. "Dr. Kellner," he said finally, "you believe these lists represent a threat to your life?" "I believe they represent a very sophisticated threat," she replied. "Someone with access to my research, knowledge of my apartment, and familiarity with natural toxins is sending me a message. The question is whether they intend to carry it out." Wolfe set the papers on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "And you, Fritz, you found your list where, precisely?" "Clipped to the message board in the kitchen, where I always post my marketing lists. But Archie's typewriter was used, and the ingredients—" Fritz shuddered slightly. "They are a mockery of proper cooking, close enough to real recipes to fool someone who doesn't know better, wrong enough to ruin any dish." "Interesting," Wolfe murmured. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the two lists. Then he looked at me. "Archie, when did you last use the typewriter?" "Yesterday afternoon for the Henderson report. I locked the office when I left for dinner." I paused, considering. But someone who knew the house well enough could have gotten in through the back stairs while Fritz was in the pantry. "Indeed." Wolfe's attention returned to Dr. Kellner. "Your research into these flavor-masking compounds? Who else had access to your findings?" "My immediate supervisor, Dr. Webb. The department head, Dr. Patricia Vance, and possibly Dr. Webb's research assistant, a young man named Timothy Marsh." She hesitated. "There's something else." Dr. Webb has been pressuring me to take a leave of absence since I made my report. He claims the stress of the discovery is affecting my judgment. And is it? Mr. Wolfe, I've been a food chemist for 15 years. I know the difference between theoretical research and practical application. Those formulas weren't theoretical. They were recipes. Wolfe was silent for another long moment. Then he spoke with a deliberate precision that meant he'd made a decision. Very well. Dr. Kellner, your retainer is $5,000. My fee, should this matter prove as serious as you suggest, will be $25,000. Fritz, no deliveries are to be accepted at any entrance until further notice. Archie, arrange for Dr. Kellner to provide complete details about her research, her colleagues, and anyone else who might have access to her apartment or workplace. You'll take the case? Dr. Kellner asked, relief evident in her voice. I'll take both cases, Wolfe said, glancing at the lists again, because I believe they are the same case. Someone has invaded my house, insulted my chef, and threatened to poison a woman who discovered inconvenient truths. That someone has made a serious error in judgment. He looked at me with the expression that meant the game was afoot. Archie, we have work to do. As Dr. Kellner gathered her briefcase and Fritz returned to his kitchen fortress, I reflected on the morning's developments. Someone had been clever enough to create shopping lists that looked innocent to casual observers, but carried deadly messages to those who knew how to read them. Someone had been bold enough to enter our brownstone and use our own typewriter to deliver threats. And someone had been foolish enough to think they could do all this without Nero Wolfe taking it personally. It was going to be an interesting week. The thing about grocery lists is that they're supposed to be boring. Milk, bread, the occasional splurge on imported cheese. Domestic stuff that keeps a household running without causing international incidents. But when Fritz Brenner finds one clipped to his message board that reads like a poison primer, and when it's typed on my own Remington with its crooked letters, you know someone's playing games with the wrong household. Dr. Margaret Kellner had settled into the red leather chair like she planned to stay, which was fine by me. Wolfe had that look in his eyes that meant the case had hooked him, and when Nero Wolfe gets hooked, the rest of us might as well clear our calendars. Dr. Kellner, Wolfe said, arranging the two lists side by side on his desk. I require a complete catalogue of your colleagues. Names, positions, years of association, and your assessment of their characters. Begin with Dr. Webb. She had come prepared, pulling a small notebook from her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years organizing research data. Harrison Webb is my immediate supervisor. 56 years old, brilliant, impatient with administrative constraints. He's been with Consolidated for 20 years and has been angling for Dr. Vance's position as department head for the past 5. I've worked under him for 6 years. And his reaction to your discovery? He dismissed it as theoretical research, assured me the formulas were academic exercises that never went beyond preliminary sketches. But the files I found were extensive, detailed studies on masking the taste and smell of various toxins, complete with simulated taste panel results. It was far beyond theoretical. Wolfe made a small sound that could have been agreement or indigestion. Continue. Doctor, Patricia Vance is the department head, early 50s, tough, fair, completely dedicated to the company. She's formidable. The kind of woman who could shut down unauthorized research with a memo. Timothy Marsh is Webb's research assistant, 27, ambitious, completely devoted to Webb. He'd do anything Webb asked without questioning it. I was taking notes, but also watching her face. She had the controlled expression of someone who'd been thinking hard about people she'd trusted, finding cracks in relationships she'd taken for granted. Anyone else with access to your research files? Owen Merritt in procurement. He controls vendors and ingredient sourcing. We've clashed over quality versus cost issues. And Serena Lake, who runs our sensory panels. She's ethical, meticulous. She came to me last month after a panelist reported tongue numbness during a sauce trial. That got Wolfe's attention. Tongue numbness. Reversible, resolved within an hour. Could have been capsaicin from peppers, but it could also have been amygdalin, a cyanide compound. Fritz, who had been hovering in the doorway with the patience of a man guarding his territory, stepped forward. "Mr. Wolfe, while you spoke, I examined the typewriter. I found these." He held out a small envelope containing what looked like grains of rice. I took the envelope and examined the contents. 7 small, irregular grains with a faint, bitter odor. "Any idea what they are, Fritz?" "Not rice, not any spice I know. But someone carrying them in a pocket or bag dropped them near the typewriter. The smell is familiar, but I cannot place it." Wolfe studied the grains with interest. "Doctor, Kellner, would these be recognizable to someone in your field?" She took the envelope, holding it up to the light. "Possibly. They look like they could be some kind of processing agent, something used in food manufacturing but not cooking. I'd need to test them to be sure." "Do so. Archie, call Dr. Webb's office. I want to see him at 2:15 this afternoon. Dr. Vance at 4 and young Mr. Marsh at 3. If any object, mention liability and reputation. Corporate executives understand those concepts even when they understand little else." I reached for the phone. Webb's assistant tried to give me the runaround about his busy schedule, but when I mentioned that his employee had engaged us in a matter touching the company's liability, Webb suddenly found time in his afternoon. Dr. Vance's assistant was frostier, requiring consultation with higher authorities before agreeing to 4 o'clock. Marsh answered his own phone and practically volunteered to come immediately. "Excellent," Wolfe said when I reported success. "Doctor." "Kellner, you mentioned that. Doctor." "Webb inquired about your home security arrangements 2 weeks ago. He said there had been break-ins in the neighborhood and he was concerned about employee safety. I told him about my alarm system, where I kept my spare key, even my daily routine." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd realized how thoroughly she'd been played. "And your apartment has been searched?" "Professionally. Nothing missing, but everything slightly rearranged. My research files were photographed. Whoever did it put them back in reverse chronological order instead of the system I use." The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. I went to answer it, finding a delivery boy from Trionfo Importers holding a clipboard and wearing the eager expression of someone who'd been promised a good tip. "Delivery for Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Specialty provisions. Prepaid." I looked at the order sheet. Our address, notation for rear service entrance, and a list that matched Fritz's mysterious shopping list exactly. Saffron, anchovies, vanilla beans, the works. "Who placed this order?" I asked. "Phone order, no card on file." From behind me, Fritz made a sound like a man discovering slugs in his garden. "We do not accept deliveries from Trionfo. They sell balsamic vinegar that is a lie." "Wrong address, wrong day," I told the kid. "Tell your boss the order is refused." He started to argue, but something in my expression changed his mind. He left with the philosophical resignation of someone learning that the world is more complicated than his job description suggested. Back in the office, Wolfe was leaning back in his chair with the expression he gets when pieces of a puzzle start forming patterns. "They test our responses," he said. "They gauge our routines and our nerve." That was reconnaissance. "Want me to pay Trionfo a visit?" "Number, they are a tool, not the hand that wields it." "Dr. Kellner, have you told anyone outside this room that you intended to consult me?" "No one. I decided last night and came here this morning." "Then someone is watching you, or someone in your circle of colleagues has anticipated your moves with remarkable accuracy." He was quiet for a moment, then looked at Fritz. "The rear door remains locked except for our regular suppliers, and only by prior arrangement. The office door stays locked unless one of us is present." Fritz nodded with grim satisfaction. And if anyone else tries to deliver groceries they did not order, refuse them politely and note the details. We are not at war, Fritz, merely at contest, but we will not be tested again without consequences. The phone rang. It was my contact at the detective agency, calling back with preliminary information on our suspects. Webb had financial pressures. A messy divorce 2 years ago, alimony payments, a son in an expensive private school. Dr. Vance was clean as a whistle, but there were rumors about budget pressures in her department. Marsh had student loans and expensive tastes. I relayed the information to Wolfe, who listened with the attention he usually reserved for Fritz's menu descriptions. Money, he said finally. The root of most evils and the fertilizer for the rest. Dr. Kellner, this Project Chimera you discovered, would the formulas have commercial value? Enormous value, but not legitimate commercial value. The compounds could mask the presence of toxins in food products, but they could also mask the presence of cheaper, potentially harmful substitutes in expensive ingredients. Someone could use them to pass off inferior products as premium goods. Or, I said, someone could use them to poison people without detection. Indeed, both applications would be highly profitable and highly illegal. Wolfe glanced at the clock. Dr. Kellner, you will remain here until this matter is resolved. Use the south room to make any necessary calls. Archie, after lunch you will visit Mr. Merritt in procurement. If these formulas are being put to practical use, he would be the conduit for acquiring the necessary materials. Fritz announced lunch with the solemnity of a man calling court to session. The sea base was perfect, the sauce verte a masterpiece of herbs and precision. Dr. Kellner ate like someone who'd been skipping meals, and I didn't blame her. When someone starts sending you poison shopping lists, appetite tends to suffer. After lunch, as I prepared to visit Merritt, Fritz appeared with another envelope. I found these in the back hallway, he said. More of the same grains, but these were scattered near the rear door. 7 more grains, identical to the first batch. Someone had been in our house twice, or they'd been very careless the first time. Archie, Wolfe said, studying the new evidence, when you see Mr. Merritt, inquire about unusual orders for food processing agents. Someone has been acquiring materials, and procurement departments keep records. I headed for the door, but Wolfe called me back. One more thing. If Dr. Webb, Dr. Vance, or Mr. Marsh asks about Dr. Kellner's whereabouts, tell them she is consulting with us on a matter of food safety. Nothing more. And if they press for details, refer them to me. I have questions of my own, and I prefer to ask them in person. I left the brownstone with the satisfaction of a man heading into battle with good intelligence and better backup. Someone had made the mistake of thinking they could intimidate Nero Wolfe by violating his household and threatening his client. They were about to learn that some mistakes carry a very high price. The afternoon was grey and cold, matching my mood perfectly. By evening, we'd have some answers. Whether our visitors would like those answers remained to be seen. Consolidated Foods occupied a midtown tower that had probably been sleek when nylon stockings were new. The lobby had granite floors that whispered, "We're stable," and a receptionist whose smile suggested she was paid to watch as much as to welcome. I gave her my credentials and asked for Owen. Merit in procurement, mentioning supplier reconciliation with potential liability implications. Her smile cooled 10 degrees while she made the necessary calls. Merritt's office was a corner of imposed order, metal shelves lined with vendor catalogs, a desk stacked with purposeful piles, and filing cabinets that looked capable of resisting both auditors and burglars. He was a thin, nervous man in his early 40s who kept adjusting his tie like it was plotting against him. When I mentioned I was working with Nero Wolfe on behalf of Dr. Kellner, his Adam's apple performed a small dance. "Food safety consulting isn't really my area," he said, gesturing to a chair that had seen better decades. "I just handle procurement and vendor relations." Actually, Mr. Merritt, procurement is exactly what interests me. We're investigating some unusual ingredient requests that might have come through your department. I let him see me write his name and the time in my notebook. People get more cooperative when they think their words are being preserved for posterity, particularly specialty items ordered in small quantities for experimental purposes. His eyes shifted to the filing cabinets. We handle thousands of requisitions every month. I couldn't possibly remember every specialty order. Of course not. That's why you keep records. I smiled in a way that suggested I was being reasonable, but wouldn't stay that way indefinitely. I'm particularly interested in orders placed in the past 6 weeks for compounds that could affect taste or smell perception. He stood abruptly and walked to one of the filing cabinets, his movements jerky with nervous energy. I'd have to check the special requisition files. Most research orders go through Dr. Webb or Dr. Vance directly, but sometimes they route through me for vendor coordination. After several minutes of filing cabinet archaeology, he pulled out a thick folder and started flipping through it with the intensity of a man looking for a life preserver. "Here," he said finally, extracting a sheet of paper. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Webb requested a rush order for several compounds from Meridian Chemical Supply. Unusual items, not our regular suppliers. The requisition form made for interesting reading. The typed list included sodium glutamate derivatives, synthetic vanilla compounds, and several items with chemical names that looked like alphabet soup. But at the bottom, someone had added 3 items in different handwriting: amygdalin extract, oleander glycosides, and something called compound X47. "This handwriting," I said, pointing to the additions. "Is it Dr. Webb's?" Merritt squinted at the paper like it might bite him. "No, that's not Webb's writing. It looks like it might be Tim Marsh's handwriting. He sometimes adds items to requisitions when Webb gives him verbal instructions. And these compounds, amygdalin extract and oleander glycosides, what would they be used for?" "I have no idea. They are not standard food processing agents. I had to find a specialty chemical house to source them, and the vendor asked twice if we were sure about the order. Said they were unusual requests for a food company." I made notes while Merritt continued his nervous tie adjustment routine. "This Meridian Chemical Supply, they delivered the order?" 2 weeks ago, but there was a problem with the delivery. The driver said someone at the loading dock signed for the shipment, but our receiving log shows no record of it. The materials just disappeared. That was the kind of detail that makes a case. Who would have access to the loading dock during delivery hours? Any employee with a company ID badge. But Pete Kowalski, our dock supervisor, keeps pretty tight control. He'd remember an unauthorized pickup. Merritt paused, then added reluctantly, "Unless someone told him it was authorized. Someone like Dr. Webb? Or Dr. Vance, or any department head. Pete doesn't question management orders." I found Pete Kowalski at the loading dock, a solid man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years dealing with delivery drivers and corporate bureaucracy without losing his sense of humor. He looked at the requisition form and scratched his head thoughtfully. "Yeah, I remember this delivery. Meridian Chemical, unusual stuff came in about 2 weeks ago. Driver was nervous about the contents, kept asking if we were sure we wanted it. Who signed for it?" "That's the funny thing. The driver said someone met him at the dock and took the shipment directly, but I don't have any signature on file. When I asked around, nobody admitted to handling it." "Could someone have intercepted it without your knowledge?" Pete shrugged. "Possible, but unlikely. I keep an eye on things pretty close. But if someone in management told the driver they were handling it personally..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Before leaving Consolidated, I made one more stop at the sensory testing suite. Serena Lake had the unflappable look of someone who'd navigated overlapping schedules and conflicting palettes for years without raising her voice. When I mentioned the tongue numbness incident, her expression sharpened. Panel 17 last month, she said immediately. The sample came from R&D Lab B, routine tomato base with proprietary seasoning, but the panelist reported numbness and we found something unusual in the retained sample. Unusual how? GCMS showed a faint signature of a cyclodextrin complex, food grade, legal, not unusual in encapsulation, but not typical for that source. As if someone had used a mechanism to hide ingredients. Did you report this? I routed it to Dr. Kellner because she oversees analytical. I also told Dr. Webb. He told me not to make waves. She paused. Tim Marsh came by twice in a week to clarify panelist comments. He's never done that before. Back at the brownstone, Fritz met me with the expression of a man who'd spent the afternoon fortifying his position. Any more mysterious deliveries? I asked. None, but I found something else. He handed me a small plastic bag containing what looked like irregular grains with a faint, bitter odor. This was scattered near the typewriter and more near the rear door. In the office, Dr. Kellner examined the grains with professional interest. These are dried seeds, she said after a moment. Specifically, Datura stramonium seeds. Jimson weed. Never heard of it. It's highly toxic. Contains tropane alkaloids like atropine and scopolamine. Causes delirium, hallucinations, even death in sufficient doses. It has a distinctive bitter smell and taste. She looked up from the bag. It's been used historically in poison recipes, often to incapacitate or disorient victims. Wolfe had been listening with the attention he usually reserved for Fritz's source descriptions. A poison that disorients rather than kills outright, he observed. Someone who prefers confusion to clarity, manipulation to direct confrontation. It fits the pattern of the shopping lists. The doorbell rang at precisely 2:15. Dr. Harrison Webb was punctual, which I took as either a good sign or evidence of a guilty conscience. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone used to being the smartest person in the room. He settled into the red leather chair like he owned it. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I understand you're consulting with one of my employees on a food safety matter. I hope Dr. Kellner hasn't been alarming you with her recent concerns. Wolfe set down his book and regarded Webb with neutral attention. Dr. Webb, I understand you've been encouraging Dr. Kellner to take a leave of absence. I've been concerned about her mental state since she made some rather wild accusations about our research file. The stress seems to have affected her judgment. And what, precisely, did she discover? Webb's confident expression flickered slightly. Some preliminary research notes that she misinterpreted. Academic exercises in food chemistry that she construed as something sinister. I see. And you ordered compounds from Meridian Chemical Supply through your assistant, Mr. Marsh? The question hit Webb like a physical blow. He managed to keep his expression neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. We used dozens of suppliers, Mr. Wolfe. I couldn't possibly remember every transaction. Of course not. But you might remember unusual orders for amygdalin extract and oleander glycosides, compounds with no legitimate food processing applications. Webb stood abruptly, his composure cracking. I think this conversation has gone far enough. If Dr. Kellner has been making accusations, I suggest you verify her claims before accepting them. An excellent suggestion, Wolfe said mildly. I intend to do precisely that. After Webb left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. Finally, he looked at me with the expression that meant the game had shifted into higher gear. Archie, he said, call Saul Panzer. I want surveillance on Dr. Webb beginning immediately, and arrange for Mr. Marsh to visit us at 3 o'clock. You think Webb is our man? I think, Doctor. Webb is a man with dangerous secrets. We'll know more after we speak with young Mr. Marsh. He paused, studying the evidence spread across his desk. Speak to him as if he were your nephew, Archie, a nephew who lies poorly. The afternoon was getting interesting, and I had the feeling that by evening Someone's carefully constructed deceptions were going to come crashing down. Someone had been playing elaborate games with grocery lists and chemical compounds, but they'd made the mistake of bringing their games into Nero Wolfe's house. That kind of mistake tends to have very serious consequences. Timothy Marsh arrived at 3 o'clock with the punctuality of a man who'd been told that being late might cost him his job. He was younger than I'd expected. Probably mid-20s, with the kind of eager, scrubbed look that suggested he still believed hard work and loyalty would inevitably lead to corner offices and company cars. His handshake was firm but slightly damp, and he kept glancing around the office with the wide-eyed attention of someone memorizing details for a report he hoped he'd never have to write. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, settling into the red leather chair with careful posture. "Dr. Webb said you wanted to discuss some research matters involving Dr. Kellner. I'm happy to help however I can." If Marsh had been any more eager to please, we could have put him in the window and charged admission. Wolfe studied him with the patient attention of a man who'd learned that young people reveal more when they're trying to be helpful than when they're trying to be careful. "Mr. Marsh," Wolfe said, arranging his hands on his desk, "you've been Dr. Webb's research assistant for how long?" 2 years, sir. It's been an incredible opportunity. Dr. Webb is brilliant. He's taught me more about food chemistry than I learned in 4 years of graduate school. And you handle his correspondence, coordinate his research projects, manage his files. Yes, sir. Dr. Webb trusts me with sensitive work. I take that responsibility very seriously. There was genuine pride in his voice, the kind that suggested he'd been told he was indispensable and had believed it. I was taking notes, but also watching his face. He had the earnest expression of someone who genuinely believed in what he was saying, which made him either very innocent or very good at lying. My money was on innocent, but in our business, innocent people sometimes do the most damage. "Tell me about the Meridian chemical supply requisition," Wolfe said, his tone as casual as if he were asking about the weather. Marsh's face went through several interesting changes: surprise, confusion, then a kind of careful blankness that suggested he was buying time to think. "I'm not sure which requisition you mean, sir. We work with dozens of suppliers for different projects. The requisition to which you added, in your own handwriting, amygdalin extract, oleander glycosides, and a compound designated as X47. That got a reaction. Marsh's careful composure cracked like ice in warm water, and for a moment he looked like what he probably was, a young man who'd gotten in over his head and was just beginning to realize the water was deeper than he'd thought. Dr. Webb asked me to add those items to the standard order. He said they were for a special project, something confidential that required additional compounds for comparative analysis." His voice had the strained quality of someone who'd rehearsed an explanation but wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. And did Dr. Webb explain the nature of this special project? Not in detail. He said it was proprietary research, something that could give us a competitive advantage in flavor masking technology. I didn't ask questions. Dr. Webb doesn't like to be questioned about his research methods. Wolfe leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. "Mr. Marsh, those compounds are highly toxic. Amygdalin breaks down into hydrogen cyanide. Oleander glycosides affect cardiac function. They have no legitimate applications in food processing. Did Dr. Webb explain why he needed poisons?" The word poisons hit Marsh like a physical blow. He went pale, then flushed, then pale again. "Poisons? No, sir. You must be mistaken. Dr. Webb would never work with anything dangerous. He's a respected scientist. He follows all safety protocols. Yet you ordered the compounds yourself. You coordinated the delivery and arranged for the materials to be collected at the loading dock without going through normal receiving procedures." "I didn't arrange the pickup," Marsh said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "Dr. Webb handled that himself. He said the materials were sensitive and needed special handling to avoid contamination." I exchanged a glance with Wolfe. According to Pete Kowalski at the loading dock, someone had intercepted the delivery, but nobody had admitted to it. Now we had Marsh claiming Webb handled it personally, which meant either Marsh was lying or Webb had been more directly involved than he'd admitted. When did Dr. Webb collect these materials? 2 weeks ago, the day after they were delivered. He came in very early, before the regular shift started. He said he wanted to avoid questions from other departments about the special project. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving between Marsh's face and the notes I was taking. "Mr. Marsh, have you ever been to Dr. Kellner's apartment?" "What? No, sir. I've barely spoken to Dr. Kellner outside of departmental meetings. Why would I go to her apartment?" "Have you been to this house before today?" "No, sir. This is my first time here. I'd never even heard of you before Dr. Webb mentioned you. We're consulting on some food safety matter. Do you know what datarastramonium is?" Marsh looked genuinely puzzled. "No, sir. Should I?" "It's commonly known as Jimson weed. It produces seeds containing tropane alkaloids, compounds that cause delirium, disorientation, and in sufficient quantities, death. We found such seeds scattered in this house, apparently dropped by someone who had been carrying them. I don't understand what that has to do with me. Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps someone who handles toxic compounds professionally might carry residue on their clothing or in their pockets." Wolfe gestured to me. "Archie, would you ask Mr. Marsh to empty his pockets?" Marsh stood uncertainly, looking like a man who'd walked into what he thought was a friendly conversation and discovered it was an interrogation. "Is this really necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you have nothing to hide." He emptied his pockets with the reluctant cooperation of someone who knew he was trapped but wasn't sure how. Wallet, keys, loose change, a pack of gum, and a small envelope containing what looked like white crystalline powder. I picked up the envelope and examined it. No label, but the powder had a faint, bitter odor that reminded me of almonds. "What's this?" "I don't know. It's not mine." Marsh's voice had risen half an octave. "Someone must have put it in my pocket." "An interesting theory," Wolfe observed. "Someone planted evidence in your pocket during your 20-minute journey from your office to this house. I don't know how it got there, but I swear it's not mine." The sound of Fritz's footsteps in the hallway interrupted us. He appeared in the doorway with an expression that would have sent Napoleon reaching for his sword. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, his Swiss accent thick with indignation, "I must speak with you immediately." "What is it, Fritz?" "My saffron has been violated." He held up a small jar as if it were evidence of war crimes. "Yesterday it was pure Spanish saffron, worthy of a king's table. Today I find it contaminated with safflower petals, common safflower, the prostitute of spices." I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Fritz doesn't use words like prostitute lightly, and when he's that angry about his spices, it means someone has committed what he considers a mortal sin. "When did you last use the saffron?" Wolfe asked. "Yesterday morning, for the sauce verte. It was perfect. I would stake my honor on it. This morning, when I opened the jar to prepare for tonight's Riz à l'Impératrice, I found this abomination." He set the jar on Wolfe's desk with the care one might use for radioactive material. Wolfe examined the contents. Among the deep red threads of genuine saffron were several orange-yellow petals that were clearly not saffron at all. "Someone has been in your kitchen, Fritz." "Someone has desecrated my kitchen," Fritz corrected. "And they did it while we sat in this very room discussing grocery lists and poisons." The implications were clear. Someone had entered our house, used my typewriter, scattered Jimson weed seeds as calling cards, and now had the audacity to tamper with Fritz's spices. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a declaration of war. "Mr. Marsh," Wolfe said, turning his attention back to our increasingly nervous visitor. "You mentioned that Dr. Webb has seemed different lately." "Elaborate." "He's been working late, taking calls at odd hours, and he seems worried about something. Last week I heard him arguing with someone on the phone about money and deadlines. He mentioned something about buyers being impatient. Did you hear any names? No, but whoever it was, Dr. Webb was trying to reassure them. He kept saying the delays were temporary and that the product would be ready soon. Product? I assumed he meant one of our consulting projects. Dr. Webb does a lot of private consulting work for food manufacturers. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Saul Panzer, reporting from his surveillance post. Webb left his office early, Saul said. Made 2 stops, one at a chemical supply house, another at what looked like a specialty pharmacy. Now he's at a coffee shop on Lexington, meeting with a woman. Dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses. Looks like she's giving him a hard time. Stay with him, I told Saul. And get the license plate if she drives. After I hung up, Wolfe looked at the clock. Mr. Marsh, you may go. Return to your office and continue your normal routine, but pay attention to Dr. Webb's activities. Note any unusual phone calls, any visitors, any changes in his behavior. Do not, under any circumstances, discuss this conversation with anyone. You want me to spy on Dr. Webb? I want you to observe and remember. If Dr. Webb is involved in something illegal, your cooperation now may save you from being charged as an accomplice later. Marsh left looking like a man who'd walked into what he thought was a job interview and discovered it was an interrogation. After the front door closed behind him, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled. Well, I asked. Young Mr. Marsh is a tool, not a craftsman, Wolfe said finally. He's been used by someone who understands the value of plausible deniability. But he's also confirmed that Dr. Webb has been conducting unauthorized research, handling toxic compounds, and communicating with mysterious buyers about products and deadlines. You think Webb is selling the poison formulas? I think Dr. Webb has discovered that knowledge of how to mask poisons has considerable commercial value to certain types of buyers. And I think Dr. Kellner's inconvenient ethics have threatened a very lucrative arrangement. Fritz had been standing in the doorway, still holding his violated saffron jar. Mr. Wolfe, he said, what shall I do about dinner? I cannot use contaminated spices. Prepare something that doesn't require saffron, Fritz. And from now on, the kitchen remains locked unless you're in it. No exceptions. And if the violator returns? They won't, Wolfe said with quiet certainty. Because after we speak with Dr. Vance, we're going to put an end to this game once and for all. The afternoon was shaping up to be educational. Someone had been playing elaborate games with grocery lists and chemical compounds, but the games were becoming deadly serious. They'd made the mistake of bringing their war to Nero Wolfe's house, and that kind of mistake tends to have very serious consequences. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Patricia Vance would arrive, and I had the feeling she was going to provide the final pieces of a puzzle that was becoming clearer by the hour. Someone was about to learn that threatening Wolfe's clients and violating his household was a very expensive form of entertainment. Dr. Patricia Vance arrived at 4 o'clock with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece and the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years earning respect in rooms full of people who thought women belonged in laboratories, not boardrooms. She was shorter than I'd expected, but carried herself with a kind of natural authority that made height irrelevant. Her handshake was firm, her steel-gray suit was impeccably tailored, and her eyes had the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived corporate warfare by being smarter and tougher than the competition. Mr. Wolfe, she said, settling into the red leather chair with practiced efficiency. I understand you're investigating concerns raised by Dr. Kellner. I hope we can resolve this matter quickly and with appropriate discretion. Wolfe regarded her with the neutral attention he reserved for people who might prove either valuable allies or formidable opponents. In my experience, that kind of careful assessment usually meant he was already forming theories about which category she'd fall into. Dr. Vance, Wolfe said, arranging his hands on his desk with deliberate precision. You supervise the research activities of both Dr. Webb and Dr. Kellner. I oversee the entire food chemistry department. 17 researchers, 6 technicians, 3 administrative staff, and an annual budget of $4.2 million. She spoke with the crisp authority of someone who knew her numbers and expected others to respect them. And you were aware that Dr. Kellner had discovered research files containing formulas for compounds that could mask the taste and smell of various toxins. I was aware that Margaret had found some preliminary theoretical work and had misinterpreted its significance. I assured her that all our research complies with FDA guidelines and company policy. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone who'd given this explanation before and expected it to be accepted. Theoretical work involving detailed studies on masking hydrogen cyanide, oleander glycosides, and other lethal compounds. Dr. Vance's professional composure flickered for just a moment. Not much, but enough for someone watching carefully to notice. Mr. Wolfe, food chemistry necessarily involves studying how various compounds interact with taste and smell receptors. Understanding masking agents is legitimate research that helps us develop better preservation methods and reduce off flavors in processed foods. Indeed, but these particular formulas went considerably beyond academic interest. Wolfe produced a photocopy from his desk drawer. This budget authorization bears your signature and approves the purchase of amygdalin extract, oleander glycosides, and other compounds with no legitimate food processing applications. Dr. Vance studied the document with the focused attention of someone examining critical evidence. After a moment, she looked up with an expression that had gone from professional courtesy to controlled anger. Mr. Wolfe, this is not my signature. It's a competent forgery, but I can identify several characteristics that prove it's fraudulent. She pointed to specific letters with the precision of someone who dealt with document authentication before. The loop on the P is incorrect, and I never dot my I's with circles. Someone has been using my authorization without my knowledge or consent. That was the kind of detail that makes a case. I made careful notes while Wolfe absorbed this information with the satisfaction of a man whose theories were being confirmed. Then someone in your department has been forging your signature for unauthorized purchases, he observed. It would appear so. Her voice now carried an edge that suggested whoever had done the forging was about to face very serious consequences. Mr. Wolfe, if someone in my department has been conducting unauthorized research and forging my authorization, I want to know about it immediately. The phone rang with its usual impeccable timing. Saul Panzer was calling with an update from his surveillance of Dr. Webb. The meeting broke up about 10 minutes ago, Saul reported. The woman left first, looked upset. Webb made 2 phone calls from a pay phone, always a sign of someone who doesn't want his conversations traced, then headed back to his office. But here's the interesting part. The woman's car had government plates. Federal government. I relayed the information to Wolfe, who received it with the expression of a man whose puzzle pieces were falling into satisfying patterns. Dr. Vance, he said, are you aware of any government contracts or consulting arrangements involving Dr. Webb? We have several FDA consulting contracts and some USDA advisory work, nothing unusual for a company our size. But those are all handled through official channels with proper documentation and oversight. She paused, clearly thinking. Why would Harrison be meeting privately with federal agents? An excellent question, perhaps because his activities have attracted official attention of a type that doesn't involve consulting contracts. Dr. Vance set her briefcase on the floor with deliberate care, the gesture of someone who decided to stop being diplomatic and start being direct. Mr. Wolfe, I think it's time you told me exactly what Dr. Kellner discovered and what you suspect is happening in my department. Wolfe gestured to me, and I produced copies of both grocery lists. The poison primer that had been delivered to Dr. Kellner and the mock shopping list that had appeared in Fritz's kitchen. Dr. Vance studied them with the analytical attention she'd probably learned from years of reviewing research data. "These are sophisticated," she said finally. "Whoever created them has extensive knowledge of both natural toxins and food chemistry. The items on the first list aren't random. They're specifically chosen compounds that would be difficult to detect in food products without specialized testing. And the second list, a mockery of legitimate cooking ingredients, but close enough to real recipes to fool someone who didn't know better. It's the kind of psychological manipulation someone might use to demonstrate their knowledge while taunting their target." She looked up from the papers. "This suggests someone with both technical expertise and a taste for elaborate games." From the hallway came the sound of Fritz's footsteps, moving with the purposeful stride that usually meant either dinner was ready or someone had committed a culinary atrocity. He appeared in the doorway with an expression that would have made a diplomat reach for his resignation letter. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, his accent thicker than usual, "I must report another violation. Someone has tampered with my spice collection again." That got everyone's attention. Fritz's spices were his professional pride, and tampering with them was roughly equivalent to vandalizing the Sistine Chapel. "What was disturbed?" Wolfe asked. "The cardamom pods. Yesterday they were perfect. Green, aromatic, properly stored. This morning I discovered that someone has mixed in several pods that are not cardamom at all, but something that smells of bitter almonds." Dr. Vance went pale. "Bitter almond odor. That's characteristic of cyanogenic compounds. Someone has contaminated your spices with something potentially dangerous." The room went very quiet. Someone had escalated from threatening grocery lists to actually introducing toxic materials into our kitchen. This wasn't psychological warfare anymore. It was a direct assault on the sanctity of Wolfe's household. "Fritz," Wolfe said with the kind of deadly calm that usually preceded very serious consequences for someone, "secure all spice containers immediately. Touch nothing else without gloves, and photograph everything before you move it." "Should I call the police laboratory?" "Not yet. First, we determine exactly what we're dealing with, and more importantly, who is dealing it." Dr. Vance had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. "Mr. Wolfe, if someone has actually introduced toxic compounds into your kitchen, this has gone far beyond corporate espionage. This is a direct threat." "Indeed. And it suggests that someone is becoming desperate enough to take serious risks." Wolfe turned his attention back to her with renewed focus. "Dr. Vance, I believe, Doctor. Webb has been selling poison-masking formulas to buyers who have no legitimate use for such information. I believe he forged your signature to authorize the purchase of materials, and I believe he's been using company resources to conduct unauthorized research for private profit. If that's true, he's committed multiple felonies and violated every ethical standard of our profession." Her voice carried the controlled fury of someone whose professional integrity had been compromised by a subordinate's criminal activity. "It's true. The question now is the extent of his activities and the identity of his buyers." Wolfe leaned back slightly. "You mentioned that Dr. Webb has seemed different lately. Elaborate." Dr. Vance was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking back over recent interactions. "He's been working unusual hours, taking private calls, and he seems anxious about something. Last month he requested access to our archived research files, specifically some older work from the late 1990s that was sealed due to ethical concerns." "What kind of ethical concerns?" "The research involved using naturally occurring compounds to alter perception of taste and smell. It was deemed too risky, too prone to misuse. There were concerns that some of the compounds could mask the presence of toxins in food products. The project was immediately terminated, and all related files were archived. The pieces were falling into place with satisfying precision. Webb hadn't invented these formulas. He'd rediscovered old, dangerous research that had been buried for good reasons, then found buyers willing to pay handsomely for information that could facilitate everything from food fraud to assassination. Did you grant his request for access to these files? Absolutely not. I told him the research was sealed for good reasons and would remain so. She paused. But Harrison has always been resourceful. If he wanted access badly enough, he might have found other ways to get it. Through his assistant, perhaps. Tim Marsh has access to many departmental files as part of his duties. He's young, eager to please, and completely devoted to Harrison. If Harrison told him the research was for a legitimate project, he would provide access without questioning the ethics. Wolfe nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose theories were being confirmed by accumulating evidence. Dr. Vance, I require your cooperation in gathering additional evidence. Return to your office and conduct a discreet review of Dr. Webb's recent activities, particularly any private consulting work and unusual requisitions. Do not alert him to your suspicions. Of course. But Mr. Wolfe, if Harrison is indeed involved in selling dangerous formulas to unknown buyers, he represents a serious threat not just to Dr. Kellner, but potentially to public safety. Agreed. Which is why we must move carefully, but decisively. Wolfe glanced at the clock. Tomorrow morning, we will have sufficient evidence to involve the proper authorities. Until then, Dr. Kellner remains under my protection, and Dr. Webb remains under surveillance. After Dr. Vance left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence while Fritz continued his security measures in the kitchen. The afternoon had been educational, but it had also been escalatory. Someone had moved from psychological intimidation to direct contamination of our household, and that someone was about to learn that Nero Wolfe takes such violations very personally. What's the next move? I asked. We tighten the net, Archie. Dr. Webb believes he's being clever, using his assistant as a tool, forging his supervisor's signature, and conducting his business through private channels. But clever men often make the mistake of believing their cleverness makes them invisible. He picked up one of the grocery lists and studied it again. He's been playing elaborate games with codes and threats, but games have rules, and rules create patterns. Tomorrow we'll use those patterns to end his game permanently. The evening was settling over the brownstone with its usual quiet dignity, but there was tension in the air, the kind that comes when intellectual warfare is about to become something more direct and decisive. Someone had made the serious mistake of bringing their criminal enterprise into Nero Wolfe's house, and that kind of mistake tends to have very expensive consequences. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that dinner was ready, his dignity restored now that his kitchen was secure. "Osso buco," he said with quiet pride. "No contaminated spices. It will be perfect." As we headed to the dining room, I reflected on the day's developments. Dr. Webb had been selling dangerous formulas to unknown buyers, using his position and his assistant to facilitate the transactions and threatening anyone who got too close to his operation. But he'd made the crucial error of underestimating Nero Wolfe's capacity for methodical, relentless investigation. Tomorrow, the game would end. Tonight, we'd have dinner and let our suspect believe he was still in control. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to let your opponent think they're winning right up until the moment they discover they've already lost. The morning brought a peculiar quiet to the brownstone, the kind that settles over a house when everyone inside knows the walls have been violated, but nobody wants to discuss the implications out loud. Fritz served breakfast with the grim precision of a man who'd spent the night checking locks and testing his spices for foreign substances. Dr. Kellner picked at her eggs with the distracted air of someone who discovered that being a target was considerably less comfortable than being a crusader. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at his usual time, but I caught him glancing toward the kitchen with an expression that suggested someone was going to pay dearly for tampering with his household routine. After breakfast, he settled behind his desk and gestured toward my typewriter with the kind of attention he usually reserved for rare orchids. "Archie," he said, "remove the ribbon." I'd been expecting this. Wolfe doesn't do fingerprint powder or microscopic analysis, but show him a typewriter ribbon and he becomes a forensic archaeologist. I extracted the ribbon spools and set them on his desk, where he arranged them with the care of a man handling evidence in a capital case. Using his jeweler's loupe, he began the slow process of reading the ribbon's memory. Every letter typed leaves its ghost impression, and Wolfe reads those impressions like scripture. After several minutes of careful examination, he looked up with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been confirmed. "Our intruder typed multiple drafts," he announced. The shopping list was revised several times with particular attention to the delivery instructions. But more interesting are the fragments of other messages. He pointed to specific sections of the ribbon. Here, Chimera Lot Y, Mask CND, Panel B. And here, ring twice, wait 30 seconds, ring once, but originally typed as ring 231 before being corrected. Chimera, I said. Dr. Kellner's name for the poison formulas. Indeed. And the corrections suggest someone who values precision but was working under pressure. The change from Dock 3 to rear service entrance indicates someone who reconsidered the security implications of their chosen delivery point. The phone rang with its usual impeccable timing. Dr. Vance was calling with information that made the morning considerably more interesting. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd spent the night discovering unpleasant truths. "I've completed my review of Harrison's recent activities. The forged signatures are undeniable. He's been authorizing purchases worth thousands of dollars using my name. But worse, I've found evidence of a consulting arrangement with something called Meridian Solutions, which appears to be a shell company." "What kind of consulting?" "According to the invoices, proprietary flavor masking research billed at premium rates. The payments are routed through offshore accounts, and the work is described in deliberately vague terms. It's clearly a money laundering operation." "And the government agent Saul observed meeting with Dr. Webb?" I made discreet inquiries. "She's with the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, tracking a series of food contamination incidents across several states. Apparently, someone has been using sophisticated masking agents to hide the presence of contaminants in commercial food products. After Dr. Vance hung up, I called Timothy Marsh, who sounded like a man who'd spent the night questioning every decision he'd made in the past 6 months. "Mr. Goodwin," he whispered. "Dr. Webb was on the phone most of the night. He kept arguing with someone about a compromised shipment and mentioned the brownstone specifically. He also changed his travel plans. Instead of the San Francisco conference, he's booked a private flight to Nassau for tonight." "Anything else?" "He's been destroying files all morning. I saw him feeding documents into the shredder, including some of the correspondence I typed for him. And he asked me to clear out his personal safe and bring the contents to him." A man destroying evidence and planning international travel on short notice. That painted a clear picture of someone preparing for a hasty exit. I relayed the information to Wolfe, who received it with the grim satisfaction of a hunter whose quarry had just revealed its location. "Dr. Webb is feeling the pressure," he observed, "but cornered men often make desperate decisions, and desperate decisions tend to be dangerous ones." As if summoned by his words, Theodore appeared in the office doorway. Wolfe's orchid specialist was usually the picture of serene competence, but now his face carried an expression of profound distress that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. "Mr. Wolfe," Theodore said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I must report a grave violation in the plant rooms." Wolfe's attention sharpened like a blade. Theodore's distress could mean only one thing: someone had dared to trespass in the most sacred space of the brownstone. "Explain." "In the warm room, among the Phalaenopsis amabilis collection, I discovered this." He held out a small plastic envelope containing a single, perfect white flower. It was buried in the potting medium of the prize specimen, the one with the variegated foliage pattern. But this is not an orchid bloom, Mr. Wolfe. It's Convallaria majalis, lily of the valley. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lily of the Valley is one of nature's most beautiful killers, containing cardiac glycosides that can stop a heart with remarkable efficiency. Someone had not only violated Wolfe's sanctuary, but had done so with a calling card that was both elegant and lethal. Wolfe examined the bloom with a kind of deadly calm that usually preceded very serious consequences for someone. His face remained impassive, but I saw the slight tremor in his hands as he set the envelope on his desk. "The plant itself?" he asked. "Disturbed," Theodore replied. "The roots show signs of recent handling, and the potting medium was clearly excavated and then replaced. Whoever did this knew exactly which plant to target, the most valuable specimen in that section." "And when did you last examine that particular plant?" "Yesterday evening, during the regular inspection. It was perfect then, undisturbed. This violation occurred sometime between 8 o'clock last night and 7 this morning." Wolfe closed his eyes and took a deep, controlled breath. When he opened them, the usual placid intelligence had been replaced by something considerably more dangerous. "Archie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Call Saul Panza. Tell him to locate Dr. Webb immediately and maintain surveillance until further notice. If Webb attempts to leave the city, Saul is to prevent it by whatever means necessary. And if he's already at the airport, then Saul will retrieve him from the airport. Dr. Webb has made a fundamental error in judgment. He has violated the sanctity of this house, threatened our client, and now desecrated my orchid collection. Such transgressions require immediate and decisive response." I made the call to Saul, who listened to the instructions with the professional calm of someone who'd handled similar situations before. "Consider it done," he said simply. "What's the timeline?" "Dr. Webb is to be in this office by 6 o'clock this evening," I told him. "Preferably cooperative, but cooperation is optional." After hanging up, Wolfe turned his attention to Dr. Kellner, who had been listening to these developments with growing alarm. "Dr. Kellner," he said, "you will remain within the confines of this brownstone until this matter is resolved. Dr. Webb has demonstrated that he's willing to escalate his methods, and desperate men are unpredictable. Your safety is now paramount. But surely the authorities will be involved when we have sufficient evidence to ensure Dr. Webb's permanent removal from society. Until then, we handle this matter ourselves." He gestured toward the lily of the valley bloom. "This is no longer about corporate espionage or even poison formulas. This is about a man who believes he can threaten this household with impunity. He's about to learn otherwise." Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce lunch, but his usual dignity was tempered by the kind of watchful alertness that comes from knowing your domain has been invaded. As we headed to the dining room, I reflected on the morning's developments. Dr. Webb had escalated from psychological warfare to direct violation of Wolfe's most sacred space. That kind of transgression, in Wolfe's universe, was roughly equivalent to a declaration of war. The afternoon stretched ahead with the promise of decisive action. By evening, we'd have our answers and our confrontation. Dr. Webb had been playing elaborate games with grocery lists and chemical compounds, but the games were about to end. When you threaten Nero Wolfe's orchids, you cross a line that can't be uncrossed, and the consequences tend to be both swift and permanent. The lily of the valley sat on Wolfe's desk like a beautiful, deadly reminder that some violations require immediate and comprehensive response. By 6 o'clock, Dr. Harrison Webb would discover that threatening the brownstone was the most expensive mistake of his career. By 1 o'clock, Wolfe had put away his jeweler's loupe and settled into the kind of contemplative silence that usually preceded either brilliant deduction or demands for beer. The typewriter ribbon had yielded its secrets like a reluctant witness under cross-examination, and the pattern of our intruder's activities was becoming as clear as Fritz's consommé. "Archie," he said finally, "you will prepare a package." He pushed a sheet of paper across his desk, covered with his precise block printing. The The message was brief and to the point, designed to look like the kind of coded communication our mysterious correspondent seemed to favor. Chimera, Lot Y, Mask CND, Panel B, as instructed, rear service entrance ring twice, wait 30 seconds, ring once 3 o'clock. You're setting a trap, I observed, studying the message, using their own system against them. I am providing them with an opportunity to reveal themselves, Wolfe corrected. They have established a pattern of behavior, coded messages, specific delivery instructions, elaborate psychological games. We will give them exactly what they expect and observe who arrives to claim it. Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who'd been asked to participate in something distasteful but necessary. If this deception requires my participation, he said with wounded dignity, I will contribute, but I do not approve of using my kitchen for such purposes. Your kitchen will remain inviolate, Fritz. The package will be placed where it can be observed but not easily retrieved. Wolfe gestured toward me. Include a small jar of saffron, adulterated with safflower petals to match the contamination of your supply. Add a tin of anchovies and a folded note with those instructions. Nothing more. I spent the next hour preparing our bait, typing the message on my Remington with its distinctive quirks, wrapping the package in brown paper, and securing it with string. Fritz contributed the contaminated saffron with the air of a man disposing of evidence from a crime scene, his professional pride clearly wounded by the necessity. At 2:45, I positioned myself at the rear peephole while Fritz took station in the kitchen, armed with a rolling pin and righteous indignation. Saul Panzer had reported from his surveillance post that he could observe both the alley entrance and our rear gate without being seen. The package sat on a chair just inside the service door, visible through the bars but tantalizingly out of reach. At precisely 2:57, a dark sedan slid past the mouth of the alley, paused for a moment too long, then continued. The occupants were clearly reconnoitering, checking for surveillance or unexpected complications. 2 minutes later, the rear bell gave 2 sharp rings, followed by the prescribed 30-second pause, then a single ring. 2 and 1, I called softly to Wolfe through the house phone. Observe and identify, came the reply. Through the peephole, I watched a man in a dark overcoat approach the gate. His movements were nervous but purposeful, and he kept glancing toward the alley mouth as if expecting interruption. When he came close enough to the gate for me to see his face clearly, I felt the satisfaction of a theory confirmed. Owen Merritt, I announced. Our procurement specialist has decided to handle this delivery personally. Merritt stood by the gate for a moment, studying the package through the bars. His face carried the expression of a man who wanted something but was afraid of the consequences of taking it. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that barely carried through the wood. Package pickup, he said, as arranged. Sorry, I called back. No deliveries today. Wrong address. His face fell, but he didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it through the bars. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. This is legitimate business. Please check with your supervisor. I let him wait while I examined the card. It was professionally printed. Meridian Solutions, Suite 410, West 41st Street. The shell company had business cards. A nice touch that suggested someone was taking their criminal enterprise seriously. Mr. Merritt, I said, opening the door just enough to be heard clearly. You can tell Dr. Webb that his shopping list was refused. No deliveries, no pickups, no further communication. The game is over. The effect was immediate and satisfying. Merritt's careful composure cracked like ice in warm water, and for a moment he stood frozen, clearly calculating whether denial or flight would serve him better. His eyes darted toward the alley mouth, then back to the package, then to my face with the desperate expression of a man who'd realized he was trapped. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but his voice carried all the conviction of a man reading lines he didn't believe. I'm just here to collect some samples to avoid a shipping mix-up." "The only mix-up here is your involvement in Dr. Webb's poison formula business," I told him. "Take your business card and go back to your office. Practice saying I was just following orders. You're going to need it." Merritt backed away from the gate with the reluctant movements of someone who'd lost an argument they'd never wanted to have. The sedan idled at the alley mouth for another moment, then drifted away like smoke, leaving behind only the lingering smell of exhaust and failed ambition. In the office, Wolfe received my report, with the satisfaction of a man whose theories were being confirmed by accumulating evidence. "Mr. Merritt's involvement was predictable," he observed. "Procurement departments are natural conduits for criminal enterprises. They have access to suppliers, authorization procedures, and plausible explanations for unusual orders." "But he's not the mastermind," I said. "He was too nervous, too eager, to avoid taking possession of anything that could be traced back to him." "Indeed. Mr. Merritt is a tool, not the craftsman who wields it. But his presence confirms that Dr. Webb's operation extends beyond simple research fraud. Someone has been coordinating deliveries, managing suppliers, and maintaining the business infrastructure necessary for a sustained criminal enterprise." The phone rang with its usual, impeccable timing. Saul Panzer was calling with an update that made the afternoon considerably more interesting. "Webb just left his office with 2 suitcases and a briefcase," Saul reported. "He's not going to any conference. He's heading for Teterboro Airport. Private aircraft, filed flight plan for Nassau. Looks like our boy is planning a permanent vacation." "Intercept him," Wolfe said when I relayed the information. "Dr. Webb has an appointment in this office at 6 o'clock, and I intend to keep it for him." "Consider it done," Saul replied with professional satisfaction. "He won't make his flight." While we waited for Saul to complete his assignment, Wolfe turned his attention to the larger implications of the case. "Archie," he said, "call Dr. Vance. I want her here at 5:30 to review the evidence we've accumulated. If Dr. Webb has been forging her signature and using company resources for criminal purposes, she has both the authority and the obligation to cooperate with our investigation. And if she's involved, then we will discover that fact through careful observation. But I believe Dr. Vance is exactly what she appears to be, a competent professional whose trust has been systematically betrayed by a subordinate's criminal ambition." The afternoon stretched ahead with the promise of decisive action. By evening, we would have our confrontation, our answers, and our resolution. Dr. Webb had been playing elaborate games with grocery lists and chemical compounds, but the games were about to end with the kind of intellectual precision that makes Nero Wolfe's methods so devastatingly effective. The lily of the valley bloom still sat on Wolfe's desk, a beautiful reminder that some violations require immediate and comprehensive response. Someone had made the serious mistake of bringing their criminal enterprise into our household, and that someone was about to discover that threatening Nero Wolfe's sanctuary carries a very high price. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that the kitchen was secure and dinner preparations could proceed normally. "The violator's package has been disposed of," he said with grim satisfaction. "My spices remain pure, and my dignity is restored." "Excellent, Fritz. Prepare something appropriate for a celebration. We will have cause for satisfaction before this evening ends." As the shadows lengthened across 35th Street, I reflected on the day's developments. We had identified the delivery mechanism, confirmed the extent of the criminal conspiracy, and set in motion the events that would bring Dr. Harrison Webb to justice. The methodical precision of Wolfe's approach was about to prove, once again, that intellectual warfare conducted with sufficient patience and strategic thinking tends to produce very satisfying results. By 6 o'clock, the game would be over, and the man who had dared to threaten our household would discover that some mistakes carry consequences that extend far beyond the original crime. At 5:15, the brownstone had the hushed anticipation of a courtroom before the verdict. Fritz had polished everything that could hold a reflection. Theodore had retreated to his orchids like a monk to his prayers, and I'd arranged the office chairs in what Wolfe calls the configuration of justice. Red leather for the defendant, yellow for the primary witness, and a semicircle of straight backs for the supporting cast. Dr. Patricia Vance arrived first, carrying a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain either comprehensive evidence or a complete indictment. Her steel-gray suit was impeccable, but her eyes held the controlled fury of someone who'd spent 24 hours discovering that a trusted colleague had been systematically betraying everything she stood for. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the yellow chair with military precision, "I've completed my forensic audit of Harrison's activities. The documentation is extensive and absolutely damning." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Forged signatures, unauthorized purchases, offshore consulting arrangements, and correspondence with buyers whose identities are deliberately obscured. Timothy Marsh arrived at 5:30, looking like a young man who'd spent the night questioning every decision he'd made in the past 2 years. I positioned him in one of the straight backs where Wolfe could observe his reactions without seeming to stare. Owen Merritt came 5 minutes later, his nervous energy barely contained, his eyes darting between the assembled evidence on Wolfe's desk and the faces around him. At precisely 6 o'clock, Saul Panzer appeared in the doorway with Dr. Harrison Webb. Our former suspect looked like a man who'd been planning a comfortable evening flight to Nassau and had instead found himself facing an uncomfortable reckoning in a Manhattan brownstone. His silver hair was disheveled, his confident bearing replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Mr. Wolfe," Webb began, attempting to reclaim his professional dignity, "I understand you wish to see me, but this is highly irregular. I have pressing commitments." "Sit down, Doctor." "Webb," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes arguments seem pointless. "Your commitments have been postponed indefinitely." Webb remained standing for a moment, clearly calculating odds that weren't improving, then settled into the red leather chair with the reluctant movements of someone who'd realized his options had been significantly reduced. Wolfe arranged his hands on his desk and surveyed the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man whose chess pieces were finally in their proper positions. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are here to resolve a matter involving grocery lists, poison formulas, and a criminal enterprise that has endangered public safety while violating the sanctity of this household." He gestured to the evidence spread across his desk. The 2 shopping lists, the contaminated spices, the envelope of Jimson weed seeds, and the lily of the valley bloom in its protective bag. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Kellner discovered research files containing detailed formulas for compounds that could mask the taste and smell of various toxins. When she reported this discovery, Dr. Webb assured her the research was theoretical. It was not. Dr. Vance leaned forward slightly. "Harrison, I've seen the Meridian Solutions consulting contract. $200,000 for proprietary flavor masking research. Care to explain what services you were providing?" Webb's careful composure flickered. "Patricia, you're taking this out of context. The research had legitimate applications. Legitimate applications for compounds that mask the presence of cyanide in food products?" Wolfe interrupted. "For substances that could hide the taste of oleander glycosides or the smell of hydrogen sulfide? I think not." He picked up the first grocery list, the one that had been delivered to Dr. Kellner. "This document is more than a threat, Doctor. Webb. It's a demonstration of knowledge and a coded message to your buyers. The items listed, bitter almonds, apricot kernels, cherry pits, cassava root, are not random selections. They represent a catalogue of natural toxins arranged in order of potency and detectability." Marsh shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't understand. It's just a grocery list?" "Is it, Mr. Marsh?" Wolfe turned his attention to the young man with paternal patience. "You added items to the Meridian chemical supply requisition in your own handwriting. Amygdalin extract, oleander glycosides, Compound X47. Did Dr. Webb explain why he needed these substances? He said they were for comparative analysis, to understand how masking agents interact with different compounds. I didn't know they were dangerous. Marsh's voice carried the strain of someone who'd realized he'd been used. Of course you didn't. You were a tool, not a craftsman. Wolfe's attention returned to Webb. But you, Dr. Webb, understood exactly what you were creating. You revived research that had been sealed for ethical reasons, refined it using company resources, and sold the results to buyers who had no legitimate use for such information. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and Webb's increasingly labored breathing. He looked around the circle of faces, searching for an ally who didn't exist. The second list, Wolfe continued, picking up the mock shopping list that had appeared in Fritz's kitchen, was both more subtle and more revealing. The ingredients were close enough to legitimate cooking supplies to fool casual observers, but wrong enough to insult anyone with genuine culinary knowledge. Belgian endive instead of French, quail eggs instead of duck, fresh yeast instead of dry. These weren't random errors. They were deliberate markers. I'd been wondering when Wolfe would reveal his deduction about the coded messages. He lifted his jeweler's loupe and positioned the first list under the desk lamp. But the true elegance lies in the structure, the first letters of each item: saffron, anchovies, vanilla, endive, duck fat, aged balsamic, yeast, sea salt, truffles, eggs, rosemary, spell Savedayster. Insert olives as the 11th item, and you have saved a oyster, a punning reference to Panel B, your buyer, whose code name was apparently Bivalve. Webb's face went through several shades of pale. That's impossible. You can't possibly. The quantities provide additional information, Wolfe continued imperturbably. 2 grams, 6 tins, 4 pods, the numbers indexed to letters spelling delivery times and locations. Your buyers appreciated elaborate puzzles, Doctor. Webb, but puzzles leave patterns, and patterns can be decoded. Dr. Vance had been studying the lists with growing comprehension. Harrison, you've been running a sophisticated criminal operation using company resources. The forged signatures, the shell company, the coded communications. This isn't research gone wrong. This is systematic fraud and conspiracy. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone, Webb said desperately. The buyers told me they were developing new preservation methods, improving food safety protocols. I thought I was advancing the science. You thought you were making money, Wolfe corrected. And when Dr. Kellner threatened to expose your activities, you escalated to intimidation, then to direct threats, then to violation of this household. The Jimson weed seeds scattered throughout my house, the contamination of Fritz's spices, the lily of the valley planted among my orchids. These were not the actions of a man concerned with scientific advancement. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted the confrontation. Fritz appeared in the doorway, followed by a woman with dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the unmistakable bearing of federal authority. Agent Sarah Rios, Wolfe said as if he'd been expecting her. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Webb was just explaining his involvement in the food contamination incidents your office has been investigating. Agent Rios took in the assembled group and the evidence with professional efficiency. Dr. Harrison Webb, she said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit food fraud, endangering public safety, and violation of federal food safety regulations. You have the right to remain silent. As Agent Rios continued with the Miranda warning, Webb seemed to collapse into himself. The confident scientist who'd entered the room had been replaced by a broken man who'd finally understood the full consequences of his actions. I'll cooperate, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything about the buyers, the distribution network, the other researchers who might be involved. But you have to understand, I never wanted anyone to die. The road to hell, Wolfe observed, is paved with good intentions and bad judgment. Your cooperation will be noted, Dr. Webb, but it cannot undo the damage you've caused." As Agent Rios led Webb away, Dr. Vance gathered her evidence files with grim satisfaction. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "Consolidated Foods will fully cooperate with the federal investigation. We'll also be conducting our own internal review to ensure nothing like this can happen again." "Your fee," Wolfe said, "is $30,000. Dr. Kellner's safety and relocation expenses, should they prove necessary, will be Consolidated's responsibility." "Agreed without reservation," Dr. Vance replied. "It's a small price to pay for what you've accomplished." After the office had emptied and the brownstone had returned to its usual quiet dignity, Wolfe sat contemplating the lily-of-the-valley bloom still resting on his desk. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that dinner was ready. Osso buco with risotto Milanese, prepared with spices that had been tested, verified, and pronounced pure. "Archie," Wolfe said as we headed to the dining room, "grocery lists are meant to be mundane documents, reminders of domestic necessities, records of household needs. When they become vehicles for criminal communication and psychological warfare, they violate not only law, but propriety. And when someone uses them to threaten your household, then they discover that some violations carry consequences far beyond their original intentions." He paused at the dining room door, looking back toward his desk where the evidence of Webb's crimes still lay scattered. "Doctor." Webb believed he was clever enough to play elaborate games with codes and threats. He forgot that games have rules, and rules create patterns, and patterns can always be decoded by someone with sufficient patience and intellectual rigor. As we settled down to Fritz's perfect osso buco, I reflected on the case that had begun with mysterious grocery lists and ended with a federal arrest. Someone had made the serious mistake of bringing their criminal enterprise into Nero Wolfe's brownstone, and they discovered that threatening his household was the most expensive error of their career. The lily of the valley had been removed from the desk, but its message remained clear. Some sanctuaries are not to be violated, and some men are not to be threatened with impunity. Justice, in Nero Wolfe's world, is always served with intellectual precision and absolute finality. The morning after brought the kind of quiet satisfaction that settles over a household when justice has been served and order restored. Fritz moved through his kitchen with renewed dignity, testing his spices one final time before declaring them pure and worthy of his attention. Dr. Kellner sat in the south room, coordinating with Agent Rios about the broader implications of Webb's network, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd survived a threat and lived to expose it. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at his usual time, but I caught something different in his expression. Not quite satisfaction, more like a chess player who'd won the game but noticed his opponent had made one move he hadn't fully accounted for. He settled behind his desk and arranged the evidence with the methodical precision of a man reviewing his work for flaws. "Archie," he said, picking up the envelope of Jimson weed seeds, "call Mr. Merritt. Tell him I've discovered an inconsistency in his procurement records that requires immediate clarification." "You think there's more to dig up?" "I think Mr. Merritt has been considerably more hands-on than his nervous demeanor suggested." Wolfe held the envelope up to the light. "These seeds were scattered by someone who carries them regularly, not occasionally. Someone whose pockets are accustomed to containing botanical samples." I made the call. Merritt sounded like a man who'd spent the night pricing one-way tickets to countries without extradition treaties, but he agreed to come immediately. The desperation in his voice suggested he knew his options were narrowing by the hour. He arrived 20 minutes later, his tie straight but his hands trembling slightly as he settled into the red leather chair. The nervous energy that had marked our previous encounters was now edged with something closer to panic. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, "if this is about my involvement with Dr. Webb's consulting work, I want you to know I was completely unaware of the illegal applications." "Mr. Merritt," Wolfe interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that makes arguments seem pointless, You typed the shopping lists on my typewriter. You scattered jimsonweed seeds throughout this house. You contaminated Fritz's spices and violated my plant rooms. Dr. Webb may have provided the formulas, but you provided the execution. The color drained from Merritt's face like water from a broken glass. I don't know what you mean. I never entered this house before yesterday. Please. Wolfe's voice carried the patience of a teacher correcting a particularly slow student. The shopping list found in Fritz's kitchen contained procurement terminology that only someone in your profession would use naturally. Oil-packed 6 tins is vendor shorthand, not culinary instruction. 500 grams is inventory notation, not recipe measurement. He gestured to the typewriter ribbon analysis spread across his desk. More conclusively, the ribbon preserved fragments of messages you typed but didn't send. Chimera Lot Y, Panel B, Ring 231, before correction to the proper sequence. Lot Y is receiving Clark notation, Mr. Merritt, not research terminology. Merritt's composure was cracking like ice in spring. His eyes darted between the evidence and Wolfe's implacable face, calculating odds that weren't improving. The physical evidence is equally damning, Wolfe continued. You carry botanical samples in your pockets as part of your work, testing potential adulterants, verifying quality, managing inventory. The jimsonweed seeds scattered near my typewriter and rear door came from your clothing, not from deliberate placement. That doesn't prove. It establishes pattern and opportunity. The lily of the valley planted among my orchids required someone with access to wholesale florists and knowledge of how to handle toxic plants safely. Your procurement background provided both. Wolfe leaned back slightly. Most telling, the thread Theodore found on the plant room latch matches the weave and dye of your suit fabric. Wool-silk blend in a distinctive pattern. The room went very quiet. Merritt sat frozen, his breathing shallow, clearly realizing that his careful deceptions had left a trail of evidence pointing directly back to him. Doctor? Webb provided the intellectual framework, Wolfe said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. But you provided the infrastructure, the shell company, the supplier relationships, the delivery mechanisms. More than that, you provided the psychological warfare. The coded messages, the contaminated spices, the violation of this household. Those were your contributions to the enterprise. I was just following orders, Merritt said desperately. Webb told me the research was legitimate, that the buyers were developing new preservation methods. I didn't know people would get hurt. You knew enough to use poison plants as calling cards. You knew enough to contaminate food supplies. You knew enough to violate the sanctity of this house. Wolfe's voice went cold. Ignorance is not a defense when willful blindness serves your profit. I was already reaching for the phone to call Agent Rios when Merritt finally broke completely. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I set up Meridian Solutions. I coordinated the deliveries. I handled the buyers who wanted anonymity. But I never meant for anyone to die. It was supposed to be about food fraud, not murder. The distinction, Wolfe observed, is academic to the victims. Agent Rios arrived within 15 minutes, her professional efficiency unchanged by the early hour. As she read Merritt his rights and led him away in handcuffs, he turned back to Wolfe with the desperate expression of a man seeking absolution he wouldn't receive. It wasn't personal, he said. It was just business. Everything is personal to the man whose house you violate, Wolfe replied. Go away. After they left, the brownstone exhaled. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that lunch would be bouillabaisse, prepared with saffron that had been tested 3 times and pronounced absolutely pure. Theodore sent word from the plant rooms that the violated orchid was showing signs of recovery and would likely bloom within the month. Well? I asked as we headed to the dining room. Criminal enterprises, Wolfe said, succeed through compartmentalization, and fail through integration. Dr. Webb believed he could remain safely removed from the practical applications of his work. Mr. Merritt believed he could execute criminal instructions while maintaining plausible deniability. Both failed to understand that conspiracy requires trust, and trust creates vulnerability. He paused at the dining room door, looking back toward his desk where the evidence of their folly still lay scattered. They brought their war to this house, Archie. They contaminated Fritz's spices, violated my orchids, and used my own typewriter to compose their threats. Such transgressions require not merely justice, but education. As we settled down to Fritz's perfect bouillabaisse, I reflected on a case that had begun with mysterious grocery lists and ended with a federal conspiracy investigation. Someone had made the serious mistake of thinking they could intimidate Nero Wolfe by violating his household, and they discovered that some sanctuaries are defended with both intellectual precision and absolute determination. The afternoon stretched ahead with the promise of restored order. The criminals were in custody, the brownstone was secure, and Fritz's saffron was pure. Justice, in Nero Wolfe's world, had been served with the methodical completeness that makes his methods so devastatingly effective. "Tomorrow," Wolfe said, raising his beer glass in a rare gesture of celebration, "we return to our proper concerns, orchids, cuisine, and the occasional client whose problems don't require federal intervention. Any requests for the kind of case you'd prefer?" "One that doesn't involve grocery lists," he said with feeling. "I've developed a profound distrust of domestic shopping." The brownstone settled into its evening rhythm, restored to the quiet dignity that had been disrupted but never destroyed. The case was closed, the criminals were caught, and the natural order of things had been preserved through the application of logic, observation, and the unwavering principle that some violations simply cannot be tolerated. In Nero Wolfe's world, that was justice enough. The morning after brought the peculiar quiet that settles over a household when justice has been served and order restored. Fritz moved through his kitchen with renewed dignity, testing each spice jar one final time before declaring his domain pure and worthy of his attention. The violation had been cleansed, the contamination purged, and the sanctity of his culinary temple restored through methodical vigilance and righteous indignation. Dr. Kellner appeared in the office doorway at 9:30, her suitcase in hand and a calm in her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived with her poison shopping list. Agent Rios had arranged protective relocation and a new position with the FDA's Food Safety Division, where her expertise in detecting dangerous formulas would serve the public good rather than corporate profits. "You've done more than save my life," she told Wolfe as she prepared to leave. "You've made them understand that some violations carry permanent consequences." "I did nothing so grand," Wolfe replied with characteristic precision. "I merely demonstrated that threatening this household was an expensive form of entertainment." Agent Rios called at 10 with updates that made the morning considerably more satisfying. Webb's cooperation had revealed a network extending across 7 states involving food manufacturers who'd used the masking formulas to hide inferior ingredients in premium products. 3 restaurant chains had been using the compounds to disguise spoiled seafood, and at least one outfit had been marketing the formulas to what the FBI delicately termed elimination specialists. The grocery list codes led us to buyers we never would have found otherwise. Rios reported, "Your typewriter analysis broke open the entire communication system. Webb kept detailed records because he thought his codes were unbreakable." Merritt's confession had provided the procurement infrastructure details that turned individual arrests into systematic dismantling of the entire operation. His knowledge of supplier networks, delivery schedules, and payment systems had given federal investigators everything they needed to trace the criminal enterprise from its academic origins to its deadly applications. Timothy Marsh had been granted immunity in exchange for testimony, his genuine ignorance of the formula's lethal applications confirmed by psychological evaluation. Dr. Vance had offered him a position in quality control, where his attention to detail would serve legitimate purposes under proper supervision. By noon, the brownstone had exhaled completely. Theodore reported from the plant rooms that the violated orchid was showing signs of recovery, its roots undamaged and its prospects for proper blooming restored through careful tending. The lily of the valley had been disposed of with extreme prejudice, its toxic beauty consigned to appropriate hazardous waste protocols. Fritz appeared in the office doorway to announce lunch with the solemnity of a man whose professional honor had been vindicated. "Bouillabaisse," he said with quiet pride, "prepared with saffron that is true and honorable, tested 3 times and pronounced absolutely pure." After lunch, as the afternoon settled into its proper rhythm, Wolfe arranged the case evidence on his desk one final time. The shopping lists, the contaminated spices, the Jimson weed seeds, the typewriter ribbon analysis, all the detritus of a criminal enterprise that had dared to violate his household and threaten his client. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical reflection, "grocery lists are meant to be mundane documents, reminders of domestic necessities, records of household needs. When they become vehicles for criminal communication and psychological warfare, they violate not only law, but propriety." He picked up the original poison list, studying it with the attention he usually reserved for rare orchid catalogues. "Doctor, Webb and Mr. Merritt believed their intelligence insulated them from detection. They delighted in elaborate codes, subtle threats, and psychological games. They forgot that every pattern leaves traces, and every code can be broken by sufficient methodical analysis. And their biggest mistake? Bringing their war to this house, contaminating Fritz's spices, violating my orchids, using my own typewriter for their threats." His voice carried the deadly calm that had marked the case's resolution. Such transgressions require not merely justice, but education about the consequences of challenging established order. The phone rang with Agent Rios, calling to report that Webb had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while Merritt received 8 years for conspiracy and cooperation. The Consolidated Foods investigation had resulted in new FDA oversight protocols and industry-wide reforms in research authorization procedures. "Your methods," she said with professional admiration, turned what could have been a simple poisoning threat into the exposure of a national food safety crisis. The typewriter analysis alone prevented dozens of potential deaths. As evening approached, Fritz announced dinner with the satisfaction of a man whose world had been restored to proper balance. The osso buco was perfect, the risotto prepared with saffron that had been tested, verified, and pronounced worthy of a king's table. The wine was honest, the bread was pure, and the conversation returned to civilized topics, orchids, cuisine, and the occasional philosophical observation about human folly. "People imagine that appetite is simple," Wolfe said between courses, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "They think hunger is merely a hole to be filled and taste is carnival entertainment. They are wrong. Appetite is discipline, perhaps the most honest one left to us. It requires knowing what we want, knowing what a thing truly is, and refusing adulteration." "Plain speaking for sauce," I observed. He ignored my irreverence with practiced dignity. What those men sold was not merely criminal formulas. It was an invitation to stop caring whether things are what they claim to be. If you can mask rancidity and call it freshness, poison and call it nourishment, you can corrupt a civilization without touching its courts. A kitchen is sacred not because it's private, but because truth is supposed to be safe there. After dinner, the brownstone settled into its evening, rhythm with the satisfied sigh of a house that had endured violation and emerged stronger. The office lamp made its usual circle of order on Wolfe's desk, now cleared of evidence and restored to its proper function. My typewriter sat where it belonged, its ribbon replaced and its keys cleaned. ready for honest correspondence rather than criminal codes. "Tomorrow," Wolfe announced, settling behind his desk with a book of Montaigne's essays, "we return to our proper concerns, orchids, cuisine, and clients whose problems don't require federal intervention. Any preference for the type of case you'd like to see?" "One that doesn't involve grocery lists," he said with feeling. "I've developed a profound distrust of domestic shopping." I set the chain on the front door and checked the rear entrance, which clicked with the satisfied sound of a lock that had decided to be reliable again. The kitchen smelled of cleanliness and proper order, the refrigerator hummed its small hymn of contentment, and upstairs the orchids maintained their extraordinary silence. Not consent, but the profound peace of sanctuary restored. Back in the office, I sat at my desk and started typing the final case report. The O was still crooked, the L still leaned, but the ribbon held only honest words now. No codes, no threats, no elaborate games of criminal intellect. Outside, the city went on being itself. Inside, we did the same. And if you think that's small satisfaction, you don't understand how civilization is preserved. One grocery list, one contaminated spice jar, one violated orchid at a time, by men who refuse to tolerate the corruption of simple, honest things. The case was closed, the criminals were caught, and the natural order had been restored through the methodical application of logic, observation, and the unwavering principle that some violations simply cannot be tolerated. In Nero Wolfe's world, that was justice enough.